You cannot grow an economy if there is no reliable base power. You just cannot do it. It's not possible, and that is one of the reasons that our economy has contracted over the last many years. Is because the government decided to monopolize the generation of power in South Africa and then fail at doing that. I'm not a free speech absolutist, but I get quite close to being a free speech absolutist. And in my view, there shouldn't be such a thing as hate speech because it's not relevant that people hate.
You're welcome to the Beyond Africa podcast with me, Ngalim Bernard. 2 weeks ago, I brought to you a conversation with Martin van Staden, who is the head of policy at the Free Market Foundation in South Africa, and also the editor of the Race Index Laws in South Africa. That was part one of our conversation. Today, I'm bringing to you part two of the conversation, where we talk on the broad-based Black economic empowerment and its effects on investments in South Africa, the Expropriation and Property Acts, lessons from Zimbabwe and Venezuela, and his perceptions on the decisions, the court's decisions on the Kill the Boer chant, and also his recommendations about adopting the free market approach as the remedy to encouraging investments in South Africa, regardless of racial makeup. Stay tuned as I bring my conversation with Martin to you.
Hello, let me interrupt you. Kindly like, subscribe, and share. That is the best way to keep us going. My little squirrel over here tells me you need to subscribe, like, and share. Do you agree with the squirrel? Please do, and let others know what is happening here. Thank you.
Is it this broad-based Black Economic Empowerment Act keeping Starlink, Elon Musk, from investing in South Africa?
Well, I can't speak to what Mr. Musk's kind of real reasons are, but from what he said and from what I understand from our legal environment, our legal kind of dispensation is that, yes, that he has to comply with it. This notion that, no, it's because he's not adhering to local laws. It's not nothing to do with his race. It's because he doesn't adhere to local laws that he can't do. It's like the local law is the law that says Starlink must have this transformed kind of a transformation deal before it can do business in South Africa. So it absolutely has to do with the racial composition, not of Elon Musk, the man, but of his company, of his board, of his shareholding. That is absolutely a consideration for many industries like mining, and I think for telecommunications and internet and so on. To get an operating license from ICASA, the Independent Communications Regulator of South Africa, to get an operating license, you need to show your Black Economic Empowerment certificate. You have to have a BEE certificate that shows what your score is. So there's nowhere in our economy, really, like nowhere in the economy where you can operate without engaging with BEE at some level. Maybe it's not the BEE Act specifically, but the regime of BEE goes beyond the Act. Like I said, there's the Employment Equity Act, there's the Competition Act, the Public Procurement Act, and so forth. These all have BEE elements written into them that kind of follow the logic of the BEE Act of 2003. There is nowhere you can operate in the economy without engaging with that to some degree. So if Elon Musk says that, hey, it is because of the BEE Act that I do not want to invest in South Africa, then that is the reason. And the solution is obvious. And the solution, I mean, I hate even describing it as a solution because it's such a default thing. Do not judge people on their race. Like if someone wants to invest in your country, just let them invest in your country. That can only benefit us. It will cost us nothing for him to come in here and build infrastructure. Yes, he's going to compete with local players, and that might drive down costs, one hopes. But ultimately, it costs the government nothing. It brings in boatloads of tax revenue for the state. It probably creates some jobs. It makes internet access available, starting, of course, with wealthier South Africans, but eventually trickling down to rural areas. And the benefits that I've heard from security experts that Starlink could represent for rural crime fighting. We have a big rural crime problem in South Africa. How Starlink could help solve that. I mean, that in itself should be a reason for us to start implementing it. So one of my colleagues from the Institute of Race Relations, I think, described BEE as a domestic sanction. It is a sanction that South Africa is imposing on itself. It's not an empowerment tool. It is something. It's it's a handicap that we put on ourselves. So just do away with that. And sure, if you want to do empowerment as government, then fine. Subsidize the black industrialists. Do something like that, which is still rent seeking. It's still bad, but that is less economically destructive than closing economic doors or closing doors of economic activity to people who just want to come and make money, who just want to come and help contribute to economic development. Don't do that.
Do the directives state the qualifications that the blacks must have to be employed, or it just says people of the black race must be employed when you are investing in a so and so industry?
So I'm not entirely sure of those details. I know when it comes to employment equity, the principle basically is that when there are similarly qualified people and one of them is white and one of them is black, you have to prefer the black candidate. In practice, it doesn't play out like that because the companies they just want to up their BEE score because they're interested in a contract. They're not going to be doing kind of bean counting. They're going to say that, okay, these people seem more or less in the same ballpark, so we're going to appoint someone based on political considerations, what the Act requires us to do. Now, as far as the BEE Act is concerned, I'm not sure what it says about that. Now, I would say that it probably does not say anything about qualification because the BEE principle, as distinct from employment equity, is about ownership transformation. It is not about kind of day-to-day work that you have to do as an executive. The BEE Act's principle is that we have an untransformed spread of ownership in South Africa, and we need the black majority to own more of the economic pie. And that I don't think is going to include qualifications, and I think rightly so. If you want to do empowerment, I don't think you can say that if you're an unqualified 60-year-old black man who's very wise and has has a business of his own that you do not qualify because you don't have a degree or something. I think that would probably be overdoing it. But again, I mean, the principle is that actually the government has no business forcing companies or even civic associations to engage in racial bean counting. We must take the win of investment. We must encourage investment regardless of what the racial makeup is of that investment.
Investors are still coming into South Africa despite these legal hurdles.
No, I don't think so. Our foreign direct investment has certainly gone down. I can't give you the exact numbers for that, but that's something that can immediately be verified. It's gone down. Domestic investment is going down, and that's really just a function of an economy that is slowly collapsing. As I've already mentioned, that the one of the big accelerators of that has been the state of no electricity in South Africa, and having no electricity in South Africa was to some degree a function of these racial laws. Eskom used to be a very lean institution, a very lean company that provided cheap electricity. I still think monopoly is bad, even though it might have operated better in the past. But in the early 2000s, the early 2010s, Eskom appointed thousands of new redundant employees so that it can achieve the target set out in its employment equity plan, which upped its own BEE score. And that made Eskom a far more expensive institution for taxpayers to maintain. And of course, none of that money was invested in constructing new power stations and so on. So kind of powerlessness, electricitylessness is one of the reasons that investment dried up. But of course, as we see here with Elon Musk, it's playing out very publicly because of who Elon Musk is and because of who Donald Trump is to some degree. So it's playing out very publicly, something that ordinarily plays out behind closed doors and silently, which is an investor who wants to come to South Africa. He's a European, or he's an American, or he's even Asian, and he sees, okay, I want to invest in South Africa, but my goodness, if I do that, I have to have these kind of political deals in place. I am not willing to do that because South Africa is a relatively small market. So we're not a priority for which people will move mountains. So because we're a relatively small market, we should be making it so easy to invest in South Africa that it's not even a question for investors. It should just be rote, mechanical. Yes, going to South Africa, we're expanding our market, but instead we make it difficult for them. And if you as a small market make it difficult, they're just going to look over you. And that's what's happening.
Are Chinese companies coming in to replace these other companies from the United States?
You see some of that. I mean, the ANC has a close relationship with the Chinese, and Naspers, South Africa's biggest company, Naspers, is a shareholder in Tencent, which is a big Chinese company. So you do see that, but you do not see that at replacement scale. You don't see Western funds and kind of investment leaving and China replacing that one-to-one. That's simply not happening. Maybe if that's what was happening, it wouldn't have been that bad economically. But the Chinese model has never been a kind of traditional free enterprise money-making investment model like you see in the West. It's very much about what the interests are of the Chinese state and what it regards as being in its national interests. That is what it will do. So there's very little dynamism in, yeah, maybe some Chinese companies invest and others don't. So no, it is happening. There's also been talk of Chinese individuals buying up a lot of farmland in South Africa. I don't think it's happening at a huge scale, but it's not. If that was the value proposition that we were being given to say that don't worry, China will replace the West, and that happened, then yeah, I mean, sure, it wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world, but it's not happening at the necessary scale.
Let's shift gears and talk about this law that you do not classify as a race-based law, but has been argued in the media as a race-based law. That is the Expropriation Act. Why didn't you classify that as a race-based law? Because on its face, people argue that white land is going to be taken, and Donald Trump even tweeted that the white farmers are being treated unfairly.
Yeah, so the principle of intentions don't really matter, must apply both ways. So even if the government says we want to do something good with this law, that doesn't matter. And even if the government says we want to take white land with this law, that doesn't matter. It does not matter that they've said that. What will matter is, so firstly, the text of the act has no explicit racial reference. So there's no explicit operationalization of a person's race, ethnicity, or skin color. There is a question around the public interest criterion. It says the state may expropriate land at no compensation. That means it may confiscate the land if it is in the public interest. The public interest is defined as including the nation's commitment to redressing the injustices of the past. Now, that could in time prove to be a racial provision. So we do have coded language in our laws about race. So there's the phrase of previously disadvantaged and disadvantaged by unfair discrimination. These are references in many laws that are recorded as race laws in the index, because in practice, these terms are enforced as racial provisions. Now, the Expropriation Act is a new law. The public interest criterion is a new phenomenon in property law in South Africa, for lack of a better word. So we might in time see that the Expropriation Act is in fact a race law. But right now, we don't know that. Even though the politicians say, of course, their intention is very much to confiscate white land. But if in practice it turns out that expropriating authorities and the courts are interpreting public interest non-racially, then it will not be classified as a race law. It's still a bad law. It's still a terribly bad law, even if it's enforced non-racially. But it could well be a non-racial bad law.
Let's look at it from the free market perspective. I know you're saying it's a very bad law from a free market perspective. Am I right?
Yes, yeah, of course. Yeah. No, so there's no country in the world right now that is very successful that has a regime of property confiscation. Every country in the world has expropriation laws, and that means that So in every successful country, that means that when the state, as a last resort, needs to acquire property for a reason of social improvement, then it may take that property from the owner without the owner's consent, provided, and this is part of the definition of expropriation as a legal concept, not as the part of any country's law, but as a legal concept, provided that the owner is paid compensation for the expropriation. What does compensation mean? Compensation means that an injury takes place and you are placed in the position that you would have been had the injury not taken place. That is what compensation means. So you have to be compensated if your property is expropriated. In South Africa and in Venezuela and in Zimbabwe and in North Korea and so on, we have adopted a perspective of no, we will not pay what is in fact market-based compensation, but we will pay, if we pay you anything, we will probably pay you below market compensation. That means it is not compensation anymore. And if we pay you nothing, it is simply confiscation. The property has just been taken. And as I alluded to earlier, no investor, and even no South African, no South African who is here is going to develop their property, invest in it, make it more economically productive, if the risk exists that they could lose that property to the amount of zero or even lose it at below market-based compensation. The risk is simply too great. And the people say that Donald Trump is spreading misinformation, that he says that white land is being confiscated at scale. It doesn't have to be confiscated at scale. It only takes one or two properties in this country to be confiscated without any compensation for that to be the end of sustainable investment for the foreseeable future, and understandably so and rationally so.
Under Chapter 5, at Section 12, subsection 3 of the Expropriation Act says the nil compensation may be in cases where the land is not being used and the owner's main purpose is not to develop the land or use it to generate income, but to benefit from appreciation of its market value. Do you still argue against that? It seems fair.
No, it seems terribly unfair. No. It's very normal for people to acquire property and then sell it at a higher price later. That's a kind of a normal business move to make. And if it's your property, that must be up to you. The state is being extremely presumptuous, extremely arrogant to presume that it has any kind of expertise, any kind of insight, any kind of capacity to come and dictate to people what they may and may not use their own property for. And it's not like there's some epidemic in South Africa of land just not being used. South Africa used to be a net exporter of food. We exported more food than we imported. And that's saying something. So it's not like there's this sickness in South Africa of people buying up these huge pieces of land and just sitting on them and waiting to sell them in the future. Yes, it's speculated that happens, but not at the scale that the impression this act tries to create. This happens in any free enterprise country. People buy property to sell it later at a higher amount, and they even probably develop that property a little bit to make it sell for even more. So no, of course that must never be in the act. The only potentially justifiable reason there, and just to kind of explain to the listeners, there's a list of 3 or 4 examples of when property may be confiscated at no compensation. It's not a closed list, so the government can take property at no compensation for any reason in the public interest, any reason whatsoever. Those are just examples. So of those examples, there's 2 that I think might make some sense, although it would still take some convincing, and that is state land. If a organ of state is not using the property for its primary purpose, then I think there might be an argument to be made for the state to expropriate that property at no compensation. I think that's a silly way for the government to approach the issue. I think that it must do an internal land transfer or an internal property transfer. That makes more sense, but fine. If you want to call it expropriation, then fine, do so. And the other thing is state investment. So, and this is also very qualified. The Act says that property may be taken for no compensation if there are circumstances where the value of the state's investment into the property kind of would exceed its market value. Sure, that kind of makes sense, but I think only under very controlled circumstances. If you as the current owner received a cash injection from the state last year into your property to the tune of billions of rands, then maybe then the state can just take the property. But if you're a subsequent owner and you yourself did not benefit from the state subsidy or investment, or if there is a long enough time that has elapsed since the investment, then no, of course, then you still have to be compensated at market rate, because this is probably your income generating asset. You own it. It's your property. Ownership must have meaning. It must mean something. It is yours, and the state is acquiring it or proposing to acquire it against your will, and therefore it must make right that damage.
Is the Free Market Foundation challenging this law in court?
Yes, so no cases have been lodged yet, except by the Democratic Alliance. So we are getting involved as an amicus curiae, a friend of the court. So we're not initiating anything, but we are going to get involved in one of the cases as an amicus curiae. We're trying to ascertain which one makes the most sense. The DA case is a procedural case, so they're challenging the process of the adoption of the act, which I think it's a relatively good case. I would be surprised if they lose it, but our South Africa's courts aren't really great, so they might lose it. And we might get involved in that case, or there's at least two other cases. I can't share with you who, but I know of at least two other cases that are probably going to be initiated in the next few weeks or months, and we might get involved in one of those. And there might be even other cases still.
From your legal analysis, is there any provision in this act that would warrant the act to be stricken down for unconstitutionality?
So yes, the Democratic Alliance's argument is that the way it's been adopted means the whole thing is unconstitutional, and they've identified two provisions about sequencing in the act that they say make it unworkable, the whole act unworkable, and therefore it must be struck down on that basis. Like I said, I think those are okay arguments. For me, the key provision is the one that we just analyzed, which is the nil compensation provision. So South Africa's Constitution 25(2) and 3 make it very clear, it's explicitly clear that when the state expropriates property, it must pay. This is there. The word payment is in there. It must pay an amount. The word amount is in there of compensation. The word compensation is in there, and it must be just and equitable. Now, Section 12(3) of the Act says that no, the state may expropriate property by paying nothing. So this is what a law student is taught as, like in the first year of kind of legal studies, is that this is a basically unconstitutional law. It is on its face unconstitutional. You cannot take nothing, like here I have nothing. I cannot pay that to anyone. Payment is a transfer of value from one person to another person. That is what a payment is. You cannot do that with nothing. Nothing is not an amount. Zero is a number, but 0 rand or $0 is not an amount. And of course, it is not compensation. Again, compensation means you are put in the position that you otherwise would have been had the damage not been done to you, the expropriation. So it is, if you're paid nothing, you have not been compensated. And even if you're paid 1 rand, 2 rand, 100 rand, 10,000 rand, you have still not been compensated. The transcendent legal principle, and this will offend a lot of people, the transcendent legal principle is that you must pay market-based compensation. That is the only way that the word compensation makes legal sense. So on that basis, the nil compensation regime in the Act is unconstitutional. I don't think necessarily that rises to the whole Act being declared unconstitutional. I think the rest of the Act is bad law because it makes it easy for the government to expropriate land, easier than it used to be, in my view. But that is not necessarily unconstitutional. I think it's a counter-constitutional sentiment, but it's probably that's probably allowed, but the no compensation is not allowed, and below market value compensation, in my view, except under the most unimaginable exceptional, is simply not allowed.
Yeah, because even when you look at the performance standards of institutions like the World Bank, the IFC, they ask you to do fair market or even better conditions, never below never the market conditions. So, but before this act, its predecessor act, has the government been expropriating land, and how has the compensation been?
So the 1975 Expropriation Act, which is the previous one, was in my view a pretty good expropriation act. It used to be a race law, but it was deracialized. So by the time it was repealed, it was no longer a race law. So its standard was market value, and it made provision for solatium. Solatium is kind of an additional amount of compensation that the state pays, essentially to say sorry for the disruption. It's not your fault. We have to acquire a property for a reason of social improvement, but it's not your fault. So here's some extra money over and above compensation. So it was a very small amount of money, but it should have been adjusted for inflation, but it hasn't. So under that act, the state could not expropriate property without compensation. It had to pay market-based compensation at least. Now, that does not mean that expropriation without compensation hasn't taken place. Like I alluded to earlier, our courts, it's kind of hit or miss, and it's increasingly more miss with our courts. So in the year 2002, I think, the Parliament adopted the Mineral and Petroleum Resources Development Act, which essentially nationalized South Africa's privately owned minerals and petroleum resources. It took it from private ownership, put it in the hands of the state. It tried to use the euphemism of the state as the custodian, not the owner, but I mean, substance over form is always the principle that must apply. The state has become the owner of minerals in this country, and it took that property from the owners without paying compensation. Now, it did replace those rights with lease rights. Essentially, you get a license as a mine or as a prospector to mine and to kind of extract wealth and to beneficiate it and to sell it and to make money from it. So you did get something, but it was not compensation, certainly not for what I would imagine would be the value of that asset, of sitting on top. And the common law rule is that if you own the land, from heaven to hell, everything belongs to you. So if you are a property owner on a gold field, I would imagine that the state simply would not have been able to pay you market value for the expropriation. So the state simply confiscated it. And the court in 2012 said that that is okay. The state did not expropriate it. It simply became the custodian. So this is not an expropriation. But in fact, it was an expropriation. The court completely got that judgment absolutely wrong according to all kind of basic legal reasoning principles. So the state has done that before, but it has never kind of directly used expropriation law to take property without compensation. It couldn't, but it has found other means to do that. So now the worry is that the law formally and clearly countenances that type of conduct, and that it's going to start happening a lot more frequently, which would be the kiss of death for the economy.
I want us to round up, but we cannot round up without looking at your comments on the Kill the Boer judgment that was recently finalized by the Constitutional Court after an appeal from the Supreme Court of Appeal. You are of the opinion that the judiciary of South Africa has been unduly politicized by institutions like the Judicial Service Commission, and that means that judges could be reluctant to issue judgments against the most vocal and influential among their appointers and promoters. How did you arrive at this conclusion?
Yeah, so the issue, and look, this is a normal thing for how courts are appointed around the world, but it's a problem still. And I think in Africa, it's potentially more of a problem given in my view, relative toxicity of African political classes that don't actually care about the liberty and interests of the people. And increasingly, this is how it's working around the world. But essentially, The Judicial Services Commission is a political body that is primarily comprised of members of parliament. So if you have the most seats in parliament, you have the most seats ultimately on the JSC, or at least a plurality. And then there's some nominated positions from the attorney's profession and the advocates and from the courts. So, but ultimately, if you're a politically dominant force, then the JSC will at the very least not come to conclusions that you completely disagree with. You won't be able to allow it to do that. Now, personality also factors into this. A lot of the kind of parliamentarians who go to the JSC aren't necessarily the leaders of their respective parties. But in the case of the of what I've said about Kill the Boer, is that Julius Malema, the man himself, the leader of the economic freedom fighters, is potentially the most vocal and prominent person sitting on the JSC. So what does the JSC do? It submits recommendations to the president for who must be appointed to the courts, and basically the president defers entirely. So the president appoints who the JSC says. Then the JSC is also the body that recommends promotions. If you want to go from the High Court to the Supreme Court of Appeal, to the Constitutional Court, and so forth. So you as a judge generally need to be on the JSC's good side. And under normal circumstances, me saying that wouldn't be a problem. It becomes a problem when the most prominent and vocal person on the JSC happens to be the accused in a hate speech case. Then it becomes a significant problem. And unfortunately, since this litigation began many years ago, it's very old litigation that has only now kind of reached its conclusion. The courts have bent over backwards to accommodate Julius Malema. Now, a lot of people say it's very rich. I'm a white guy. Of course, I'm going to say that. But yeah, I mean, I can't do anything about that. The reality is, based on my legal analysis of what has played out in the courts, it is clear that very massive concessions and accommodations have been made for this man that the courts have not made for civilians, for ordinary people in recent history, when there have been hate speech cases against relatively powerless, normal people, certainly racists and bigots and homophobes and so on. The book has been thrown at them, and some of them went to prison. They were levied massive fines that kind of wiped them out economically. Julius Malema has not received any punishment whatsoever from our courts for the things that he says and does. Now, it's not just Kill the Boer. A lot of people fixate on the song Kill the Boer. I do not believe that Kill the Boer should be banned as a song in the abstract. I don't think anything should be banned in the abstract. But in a tangible manifestation of it, there might be legal consequences. Now, Julius Malema has sang this song many times, led tens of thousands of people in singing this struggle song. And yes, maybe in court we can prove that no, it's figurative, he doesn't mean it, and so forth, and that's fine, cool. Then that's proven, and he's not guilty of hate speech. That is not what happened. In our case, in the AfriForum case, which we got involved at the Supreme Court of Appeal level, Julius Malema sat in the witness box. He was called as a witness by the applicants, or he was cross-examined by the applicants. And they asked him to elaborate on what the context is of what it is that he means when he sings Kill the Boer. Now, superficially, he did say, yeah, it's figurative, but he also explained that he and his party are violent and militant, and that they have no pretension to being a peaceful or a moderate organization. He said that they are very willing to blow up the union buildings. That's the seat of our executive government. He said that if Parliament adopts a constitutional amendment that says all the whites in South Africa must be killed, genocide, then that would be a valid thing that the government must now do, because Parliament has taken a decision to adopt a constitutional amendment. And he kind of explained this without kind of any kind of show of hesitance. He explained that, so the advocate who was cross-examining him said that in at least one case of a farm murder, the words Kill the Boer were written with the blood of the victims on the wall. These people were brutally tortured and killed. and then their blood was taken by the assailants, and "Kill the Boer" was written on the wall. And the advocate asked, "What is your take of this? Do you feel remorse? Do you feel some complicity?" And Malema said that he feels absolutely nothing. He didn't just say that it's not his fault. He just said that doesn't touch him at all. But the key thing, which to me, remember, we're now in the process of sketching context. We're not, the text is "Kill the Boer." Now we're chatting about the context. The key thing that Malema said was, when he was interviewed about "Kill the Boer" previously by some TV station, the interviewer asked him, "Do you understand, Mr. Malema, that some people hearing this might interpret this as you calling for the killing of white South Africans?" Julius Malema's answer to that was, "We are not calling for the slaughter of white South Africans, at least for now." That is what he said, recorded on TV. So now we're in court, and the advocate asks Julius Malema, "Cool, you said this on TV. Let's unpack this. Could you call for the genocide of white South Africans, the racial slaughter of white South Africans in the future?" Rather than saying, "No, of course not," Julius Malema said, "I don't know the future. Maybe I would call for the slaughter of white South Africans in the future. I can't tell you right now what I'm going to do or not do in the future." And then the advocate asked him, "Will you pledge right now that you will never call for the slaughter of white South Africans?" And he said he will under no circumstances make such a pledge. That is the context. That is the context that the judge heard. That is the context that the Supreme Court of Appeal had access to, and it was completely ignored. And they said, at least at the Supreme Court of Appeal level, the court said that knowing the context, a reasonable South African or a reasonable person would regard Julius Malema's chanting of the song to be a purely political, rhetorical device that is kind of expected from politicians who are trying to garner votes. So the reasonable person would understand that this is not a call for slaughter because of the context. Now, in my view, that is simply a terrible misapplication and an error in judicial reasoning, given that the context was so clearly sketched out about that Malema is someone who harbors intentions of violence against the people he sings against, even though it's a figurative song. So, yeah.
I read the judgment from the Supreme Court of Appeals, and what caught my attention was the emphasis on the context was not the context you've given to me now, but the context on a revolutionary song, a song that is sung just to remember the revolutionary days, a song that cannot be separated from the current political context and the previous political context. But this other context of killing somebody and using the person's blood to write "Kill the Boer" on the wall, I don't think that features in the judgment. Yeah,
exactly.
Did they tender the evidence of the person's blood in court with DNA analysis?
I'm not sure about that, but there is photographic evidence the police investigated, so it's not something that's fabricated. It's something that did happen, and there were photos of that having happened. But you're completely correct. That is not the context. This the so-called context that the court was interested in. And in my view and in our view, what the court did was in fact to remove the song from its context. So you can talk about the history of the song in the abstract, of course. I mean, what will you do if a drunken sailor is a song where you kind of commit violence against the sailor? It's in the abstract, it's meaningless. It's a song from many years ago that people still sing today. So there is that context. But what is the legally relevant context when you are accused of, sure, a crime, but in this case, the civil wrong of hate speech? The legally relevant context is you. What do you mean? You as the person, not what the song's context is from way back when. What is your context? What is the context on the ground around you singing this song? You as Julius Malema. And that is the relevant context, and that is the context that the court completely ignored. And again, this speaks to what I said earlier. And just let me be clear. I'm not saying that the judges are these bad people. I'm saying that it makes rational sense for the judges to be light on Julius Malema. It makes rational sense for them to do that, given the role that he plays on the Judicial Services Commission, and maybe even given the kind of expectation that he is going to play an increasingly relevant role in national politics. It is perfectly rational for a judge to come to that conclusion. However, a good legal system and a good judge is someone who says, let the justice be done, though the heavens may fall. And that is that we will apply the law, we will apply the principles of justice, regardless of what the consequences could be, certainly for me as a judge, or even for the political system. We will apply the law and the principles of justice without fear, favor, or prejudice. And we talk a big game about that in South Africa. But the reality now, as we sit here today, is that we have a two-tier system of hate speech in this country. The one tier, it's not necessarily black versus white, although it does often play out that way. But it's effectively political elite versus non-political elite. So we have had black South Africans who have been sentenced for hate speech, for saying things that are far less kind of disgusting and violent than what Julius Malema has said. They have gone to had to pay fines, and I think some have served some prison time for saying things that are less bad than what Julius Malema said, just because they are not members of the political elite. And the Supreme Court of Appeal effectively did this in its judgment without perhaps realizing it. So when the Free Market Foundation intervened in that case, our major contribution as the amicus was that, number one, there must be one rule that applies to everyone. But if not, then you have to be stricter on politicians. Because why does hate speech law exist? It's after the Holocaust, after the genocides of the previous century. It was always political actors, powerful political actors with massive constituencies, who incite violence amongst those constituencies. And therefore, hate speech law is premised in political speech to target disfavored groups. So if anything, if you have two tiers, it must be that powerless civilians are allowed to say more heinous things than what powerful politicians are allowed to say. So you have to throw the book at powerful politicians when it comes to hate speech, given the influence and the power that they have, rather than throwing it at powerless civilians. And the court, when it rendered its judgment, effectively endorsed the principle that it's because Julius Malema is a politician and he's engaging in political activity that he is more protected, than what an ordinary person recording some racist rant on their phone would be protected for. And that is unacceptable from the perspective of constitutionalism, of limited government, and certainly of the principle of individual liberty, free expression, and so on. You cannot have this kind of two-tier system that operates in favor of the elites and against the powerless.
Yeah, though I don't completely agree with the concept of a separate class of crime known as hate speech. Most of the hate speech laws I read kind of put more emphasis or make it aggravated when it's done by politicians, religious authorities, in fact, people with a huge following. So it's really surprising to see that the Supreme Court of Appeal recognized Julius's political role, but then excused him because of that role.
It is bizarre, and let me just say, I think I agree with you completely. So I'm not a free speech absolutist, but I get quite close to being a free speech absolutist. And in my view, there shouldn't be such a thing as hate speech, because it's not relevant that people hate. It's a free society. In a free society, you must be free to hate other people. Simply, you have to be free to hate other people. And I can speak from being very close to the Solidarity movement, the AfriForum movement, the kind of Afrikaner establishment in South Africa, that it does not bother us that Julius Malema hates us. We really could not care less. Like, that does not matter. What bothers us, and what bothers any sensible human being, is incitement to violence. And that is where I draw the line. That is that if you, not in the abstract, like, you can say many weird things in the abstract, you can make jokes about killing people, that's fine. But if you make a sincere threat of violence against the life, liberty, or property of an individual or of a group, then you have transcended the bounds of what I would say even the historical liberal, classical liberal, and libertarian thinkers would regard as permissible speech. So I would much rather, under our law, say that Julius Malema should be prosecuted for criminal threats, incitement to violence, rather than something as contentious, really contentious, as hate speech law. But unfortunately, this is the law, this is the legal regime that in South African law you have to use if you want to go after someone like Julius Malema for this reason, unfortunately. So I like the common law position of criminal threats. If you make a sincere threat of violence against someone's legal interests, that is something that you can be prosecuted for.
Just one last question. Is the higher level of the courts, the Supreme Court and the Constitutional Court, are they both legal and policy institutions, or are they just entirely judicial institutions?
So we follow the common law framework of justice. So I know in France and so on, in the civil law systems, it's somewhat blurry. It's blurry in another way in South Africa, but on paper they are only courts. They are courts of law. They are superior courts, so they do not make policy. But this is an old debate in jurisprudence: is that, well, the courts do make policy and they do make economic policy as well, and our courts are not immune to that. So especially the Constitutional Court has made many judgments in the past that you could argue have a legislative effect, let's say, that they were in some way legislating from the bench. I think in some cases that's fine. I think that makes sense from a constitutional supremacist perspective. But no, they are not, at the very least, they are not isolated from our political passion, let's say, which I think is one of the key roles of a judge, is that you must, to the best of your, like, it's impossible to do it perfectly, but to the best of your ability, you must separate yourself from the social discourse, from the social passions, from the social events that are taking place. You must make an effort to cut yourself off, because otherwise, you as a court, as a judge, you're not actually solving a problem. And increasingly, South Africa's courts, after a long process of the courts being appointed by the Judicial Services Commission and being immersed in what I would consider to be an ecosystem of jurisprudence that the ANC has cultivated, increasingly our courts, our judges are part of the social discourse of the day, and they find it very difficult to separate themselves from it. We've had judges even say that the white minority should not try to use the Constitution to protect its interests, which is it's a bizarre thing for a judge to say, because that is what a Constitution is for. A Bill of Rights is there to use to protect your interests, and the judge, and I think it was thankfully a minority dissent, but still reflective of a developing trend that actually we as judges, we're not apart from the executive and the legislature, but we are in fact the guardians of the ideological project that the ANC specifically, but let's say the broad democratic movement in South Africa, the revolutionary movement, what they must be doing, we will make sure that they stay on that path. And if they step out of it, we will push them back, we will nudge them back. That is increasingly the posture, I think, that our courts are taken. I'm doing my Doctor of Law right now with my supervisor, Professor Kwes Malan, and he's written a book about this. It's called There Is No Supreme Constitution, which I can highly recommend to anyone interested in about the status of constitutional supremacy in South Africa. And he makes this argument very clearly and in detail, to say that increasingly our courts are playing an ideological role. He thinks that's natural. I disagree with my supervisor. I think that's a problem. I think it's something to start resisting against. And I think all good lawyers in South Africa, and really this applies around the world, have an obligation, a constitutional obligation, to point out to the court when it gets it wrong and to insist upon the court reversing its own prior judgments that are clearly in error.
Absolutely. I think that is what the Supreme Court of the United States is currently doing, currently undoing some decisions that they consider to have been mistakes of the past. There is so much I would like us to talk about. I have the Constitution here. I have on self-determination, but we've spoken enough. I'll let you go rest, but we need time to get a part two of this so we can get into more detailed conversation. I like to discuss these legal issues with a legal mind so that we discuss them from a perspective that is easy for any person to understand, because there are certain intricacies that are hidden behind the text, and non-legal minds will not see those very clearly. But when you discuss them with somebody trained in law, it's easier to help the viewers understand where the law is coming from and the intentions behind the law, the possible consequences of the letter of the law.
No, absolutely.
So, yeah, I'll let you go. And if you have any last word for the viewers, I'll be very happy if you can give them, but then promise them that you are coming back.
Yes, no, thank you, Baron. I'm very keen to come back. I've had a lot of fun in discussing these things with you. It's nice to go deep every once in a while. So let's do it again. Last words from me. I'm very active in the policy space. So I encourage your listeners to follow me on my social media platforms. I think start at my website. That's martinvanstaden, all one word, .com. Follow me on X, formerly known as Twitter. That is Martin_ASFL. And also please follow the work of the Free Market Foundation. That's freemarketfoundation.com, and also the Institute of Race Relations, that is IRR.org.za. And of course, where we began the discussion, the Index of Race Law. Nothing is hidden. It's all available at our website on racelaw.co.za. So there's a bunch of links to stay up to date with what we're doing and what I'm doing, and I'll be happy to chat about some of those things with you in the future again.
Thank you so much. All these links will be in the description of this video, so you can go there and get them, and I'll distribute the video on our YouTube channel and our X space also. And thank you so much again for coming, and have a great day. Dear viewers, thank you for watching this in-depth conversation. We hope you learned a lot, especially about the free markets, what Africa needs, and what we need to move the continent forward. Thank you, and see you next time. I have been your host, Ngalim Bernard, and kindly like, subscribe, and share this so that others may view and have an understanding of what is happening.